So the political was what really drew you into the discipline. And once you were there, you found all this other stuff too, not just the political, but the political still stays with you, doesn't it?
We don't go in and dig into actual language and laws and what's happening. We sort of pick a side and we grab some easy rhetorical messages and throw them out there. The tradition that I was brought up in rhetoric was this idea of listening to people and how they talk and trying to figure out, are they positive? Are they negative? What are the things that they're saying? And that when we listen to the rhetoric of the people, that really helps us understand not just each other more, but the entire political process. And we're not good at listening and getting into that nuance. So that's one of the things that really fascinates me about rhetorical messages is how much we kind of get ourselves drawn to the extremes and to the stuff that gives us that kind of what I would call a rhetorical high. And don't say gay is a rhetorical high. We're like, oh, look, here's a rhetorical moment. We can all get on that and throw things at it. And then when you say, okay, well, what does the actual legislation say? Well, I don't know, but I don't want to know. That's not what I want to talk about.
Yeah. It's not, what do you mean? It's not fun to read
Right?
bills
Yeah.
and read like the fine print. We just want the
Fun.
talking point. We want
No, what was the tweet?
spicy.
Give me the tweet.
Yeah,
Give me
yeah.
Twitter, right? And that's true of a lot of things, right? There are a lot of things where you get pearl clutching over things, and when you say, well, did you actually look at it? And people are like, no, I didn't look at it. Why would I look at it? I know enough. Oh, okay. Look at that. And we need to be better at understanding each other if we don't want to do that.
Hmm. So rhetoric is not good at nuance, but yet
Oh.
it's one of the best tools we have to achieve understanding. So how do you reconcile that tension that is embedded in rhetoric in the political sphere?
Let me put it this way. Food is one of the best medicines that we have. We still love to go to McDonald's, right? So we're not always great at deciding what is good for us and what is healthy for us. We go where the emotion is, where the drama is, where we can get passionate and where we can feel superior to other people, which is why I like the Trump book. Because if we can sit around saying, well, people who vote this way or people who vote that way were, just stupid or misled or ignorant or are unethical, that lets us off the hook of trying to understand each other. Just like if I say, well, I had to go to McDonald's because I didn't have any food in the fridge and, I don't have time to go to the grocery store and it's too expensive to buy fruit. It can let us off the hook of, and so I made a choice that was easier. So when we think about the tools that we have, it takes work to have a conversation with somebody. And I've actually tried to have conversations with people during the political time, and they get frustrated to the point like, I just can't have this conversation right now. It just upsets me too much. And so we get so emotionally worked up. And I talk about that with my students because, we teach rhetoric, and I tell my students, I'm not going to give you any answers. I'm going to give you questions. And those questions are uncomfortable and they're difficult. And one of the questions I asked the other day is, if I brought in a really controversial topic, I mean, seriously controversial, could you have a respectful dialogue with the people in the room? And some of them admitted they just couldn't do it, that they felt those topics were just too difficult to do. And that's where I get so sad,
Yeah.
because that's where the learning is. Even if you don't change your mind, which is perfectly acceptable, you are at least understanding the other point of view, which is what debaters do. Our job is to be able to argue both sides, which gives us more, at least, respect and understanding for where people are coming from.
I've been teaching, since about 2004, and the amount of emotional separation and the amount of people who just shut down at the first mention of an idea that they oppose has skyrocketed. And we've seen this in the political discourse too, where the gap is creating a inability to have the important and difficult conversations we need for a functioning democracy. Do you see a path forward? Do you see a way for us to use our discipline in some productive way to help people have those difficult conversations with those that they just don't agree with?
I think we talk more about feelings than ideas, and we don't want to hurt people's feelings. That is absolutely never the case. But when everything hurts people's feelings, it becomes very, very difficult to engage in conversation. And we have a really hard time getting out of the mindset that we're supposed to be winning an argument. And you have to get out of that mindset to have really great discussion. And you have to be willing to read and listen and learn. And that's the challenge, is getting people to go back and say, I am legitimately upset about X, Y, and Z because I've read X, Y, and Z and I've encountered X, Y, and Z. You know, be upset about Dave Chappelle. What did Dave Chappelle say? Well, I don't know. Well, then it's harder to be upset about Dave Chappelle. Language requires us to listen. Mm-hmm. That's what rhetorical scholars do. We listen and we read and we watch and we pay attention, and then we get upset, right? We're still allowed to be upset. And a lot of times there's a lot to be upset about, but until we've done that work and encourage students to do that work. And so that's what we need to be doing, is encouraging students to do that work. Take apart messages, think about it. Why is it upsetting? Go back to why. Why is it upsetting? What is the piece that's upsetting? Where is it leading? And there are legitimate things to be angry about, but know what they are and why.
Yeah, I would love to have some of your diagnostic questions, some of the ways that you have peeled back, because I heard in that explanation you talked about asking why and going deeper. Do you have a methodology there to where you will ask how first and then why second, or anything like that?
So the first thing I do is I put up a set of words so that we can all be using terminology that we're agreeing on. And what does the choice mean? So we're talking about Burke's terministic screens in some way, right? We're talking about how the language we choose is creating the reality. So if I talk about illegal aliens, that's creating a very different reality than an undocumented worker. And my entire worldview will change. And if we can't understand how your worldview is being created by the words, we're not going to come in the middle. If we're using different words for the same thing, then that's going to have a material consequence in what happens with that thing that we're talking about. And that's the challenge, is getting people to hear those different, and they start to hear them, and they're like, yeah, that's a big difference. And now we talk about something, and then we can start talking about, well, why does it matter? Well, what happens if we do this? Well, what happens if we do that? What's the difference? Yeah. And we go into different directions as those conversations go, but it's still scary and it's still difficult.
Always, right?
It's not easy.
It's never easy. I got really excited whenever you use the name Burke. Because that is like,
I love Burke. I love Burke.
That's a trigger word of happiness for me personally.
Yeah.
Because and you talked about terministic screens. Of course, we can the words that we choose select, deflect, and reflect reality, and and create a very different story, a very different narrative. And if we can't share a narrative, if we can't have a same shared story, it's very difficult to have meaningful, productive conversations that can lead to better policies for relating to our fellow humans, right? What are your other favorite Burkean themes or topics, and how have you seen those become useful with some of these modern issues?
I really love the pentad, because what it does is it lets us highlight certain things as being important. And when I talk about it with my students, I do a cat's cradle to explain that if I pull this string gets tighter, and this string changes in importance. And so if we can understand that if I'm putting emphasis over here, then I'm taking away emphasis over here. And how we understand rhetorical events really depends significantly on where I put that emphasis. And we play with that a little bit by looking at media stories. So I will have them look at a presidential story from the perspective of CNN and Fox News, really very different things. and have them do a Burkean analysis of that and think about, okay, well, where is CNN putting the emphasis? And where's Fox News putting the emphasis? And that gets us into language too, because always the language is a bit different. And it's really interesting to see them kind of wake up, not to the fact that they have different perspectives, because they already know that, but how they're doing it, which is a little different than what Fisher's doing, right? Fisher's giving us that narrative, which I also love Fisher. I mean, when we're seeing things that don't make sense to us, we get that kind of fidelity question, like, no, that's not right? No, there's no coherence in that. So they can see that really clearly. But Burke really lets us hone in on where they're doing the thing that they're doing. And I find value in being able to kind of put a microscope on that.
Our rhetorical frames from this century and centuries past can really help us to understand social media and use social media instead of letting social media use us. And I'm hoping you can speak to that.
My opinion is that social media is the worst thing that has happened to human beings in the last 20 years. The data on that is solid. People who use Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter have worse mental health outcomes. That is documented. It's been horrifically bad for children and teens and young adults. It has brought public discourse down to a level that is so base and so tabloid that we're unable to have the idea of, oh, but you have to say something concisely in 140 characters. That sounded great, right? Oh, good. We have to be concise. But what it's done is whoever has the best quip gets the most likes. And then it also lets us create echo chambers that you couldn't create before. You know, there's a great book that's out there and it's called Bad News. And I'm going to get the author's name wrong, but it talks about how we've shifted from being a space where newspapers and TV channels had to be very democratic and cover both sides of issues, because you were trying to get all the readers, right? You wanted everybody to buy your classifieds and sell their used car. We don't do that anymore. We want clickbait, 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 clickbait. And so journalists have to shift their focus from being non-biased, so they don't make anybody upset and they can cover both sides, to getting the most clicks, which means you have to be more sensational. And that doesn't usually lead to people learning both sides of an issue really well. So we just don't have very many spaces for that. I don't know where to send people for neutral news. I genuinely don't. I send people to the bill, like, read the bill, decide for yourself what you think, and read what the different politicians are saying about it so you can decide, are these people you want to vote for? But I have no idea where I would send people for really good Democratic news coverage, right? It's like, well, you're not going to send them to the Wall Street Journal. That's going to lean conservative. You're not going to send them to the Washington Post. That's going to lean a bit liberal. Read both, maybe find the middle. But that's a real struggle these days.
Sensationalism. That's always been with us, but never to the extent of not knowing where to go. This whole struggle with finding what is real, finding what is true, and truth with a capital T becomes more difficult when you have large corporate interests funding this kind of sensationalism, which muddies the waters for public discourse, right? And that muddy water is really difficult to navigate, but I would think that rhetoric would give us some tools to be able to see past the trouble, past the muddy, right? It gives us a way to kind of peel back some of those layers, or at least that's what I thought it did. Do you disagree?
It depends on who's doing the rhetoric and what kind, right? So ideological rhetoric is not meant to do that. It's meant to take down power structures, think about how rhetoric reinforces power structures, hegemony, and all of that. So it's a misnomer, and I tell my students, is to think that as rhetorical scholars, we have to be objective, right? Just like reporters do not have to be objective. We just hope that their biases are well enough known that we know what we're getting. If the purpose of rhetoric is to uncover what is causing us to maybe see a more fragmented democracy and potentially destroy democracy, which I think is part of what rhetoric should be doing, then absolutely. And so to me, it would be really valuable to think through what are the things that are being said, and why are they leading people to lean one way or the other? And I've heard, I think it was Dan Levy did a really great piece on understanding both sides in the political issue, in how people talk about the other side and why that's creating the tensions that it's creating. And his whole point was about the language we use to talk about the other. And if I make you the other, and I make you not only the other, but the stupid other, or the greedy other, or the, the other who doesn't care about people, or the other who just, can't figure it out. I am creating language that is almost impossible to get through. Mm-hmm. But that's not the way it is. I think we all have people who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum from us. And we know that these are perfectly normal, rational human beings most of the time. So we know that language isn't true, but we adopt it. Like, mm-hmm. If you don't agree with me, you're clearly a bad person. And to the point where some people are like, if you don't believe this, I want you off my feed right now, right? Yeah. Like, just unfriend me right this second. And there's no dialogue about, well, do you know why I believe that or what I think? Nobody changed their opinion by being told they're stupid, right? Nobody walked in and said, well, they said I'm really stupid and ignorant, so clearly I've got to change my opinion, right? That's just a way of shutting the door to anybody ever. In fact, that's what gets people to dig in. Say, wow, that's really interesting. I would love to know what you found, and I'd love to talk about it. And then look at the source, read it, right? Going back to what we said before, read the stuff you're saying is misinformation, and say, oh, I can see where you'd think that. I'm really interested in the study they did, though, because it doesn't seem to be peer-reviewed, or the data doesn't seem to fit. I'm wondering, where we could find something else on that. Challenge them to go down their own rabbit hole and find it. And she was like, but that's not as much fun. That's kind of where we go, right? Well, it's not fun to actually engage people and listen to them. It's much more fun just to love our position and fight for it.
You're so right. And what you're describing is really that scaffolding of critical thinking that is so important to diving in to find and support those kinds of arguments that then lead to a better path forward. When you were talking about the otherization, I was reminded of how important history is in rhetorical studies. And I was thinking about Burke's analysis of the infestation metaphor in World War II, and how he othered, how that othering happened in a way that allowed for atrocities. And we saw it again. We saw it again with Rwanda. We keep seeing the same kinds of things happening.
And it gets back to Burke, because you asked about Burke. I love Burke. Identification is one of his other really powerful concepts. And I tell people, in a lot of cases, I think identification is much more powerful than ethos, because most of the time we're really not interested in ethos. We let celebrities tell us all sorts of things that are not that particularly interesting or valuable, right? Everybody talking about the Will Smith thing. People who weren't there, people who don't know Will Smith, don't know Chris Rock, just kind of pipe up and we go, ooh, what did they say? And so identification, though, allows us to want to, so there's that identification of people we genuinely want to be like us. And then there's that identification of people who we know are never going to be like us, but we have that inspiration or that aspiration to be like them. And I think Burke does a really good job of talking about how we want to identify with very specific kinds of people.
Yeah, we want to connect with celebrities, but we also want to connect with authenticity and that whole connection. And I think that speaks to identification, like you were talking about earlier, because identification is, I am with you. I can feel your pain. I've been in your shoes. I understand you. I have empathy. And that's one of the critical tools that we need to be able to bridge divides that we've discussed, right? Empathy through the listening skills and the critical thinking skills of the rhetorical methods that we've been discussing.
I tell people, just because somebody hasn't said something doesn't mean they don't think it and believe it. And so what you're doing is pushing them back into their echo chamber. So they won't talk about it in public, where you can sort of, pick up their idea and look at it and turn it around and get them to consider it in a room full of people. Instead, they're going to go into their Reddit, subreddit, and say the same thing to people who are going to reinforce, reiterate, validate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the piece that makes me really, really nervous and uncomfortable, because eventually that little subreddit becomes a bigger Reddit and a bigger Reddit and a bigger Reddit. And that's where you start to see some really horrible things coming to pass. So I would like to get to the point where we can pull people's language and rhetoric out of the darkness, invite people to have conversations, and know that they're not going to be socially ostracized for talking about things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a great method for that, but I know I follow the Heterodox Academy. They do a lot of talking about these types of things to see if I can get some ideas about how to do that. I do the best that I can, but it's very challenging to figure out, how do we let students talk about things that other students aren't necessarily going to like, and do it in a way that they don't feel at risk of ending up on a Twitter feed somewhere, right? Somebody takes a video, you end up on Twitter.
Yeah, having closed spaces. And I'm thinking about like deprogramming from cults almost, right? Like, because that's kind of what you're talking about, right? Because if we go too deeply into our own echo chambers, we lose the ability to connect and to see the other side. So kind of that deprogramming has to happen in a safe space. But if everyone is walking on eggshells all the time because they're afraid of being politically correct, or they don't want to really say what they really think because they're afraid of investigating those ideas. I mean, there's so many layers of this. It's not just the judgment of others, it's the judgment of myself, right? Because if I have a belief that has withstood the test of time, and all of a sudden I'm being forced to look at that belief under a critical lamp and a critical lens, that can be a very scary thing that threatens my identity. And if my identity is threatened, I am going to shut down so much faster and shut the critical part of my brain off so much faster, right?
I ask them to follow people they don't agree with on Twitter universally. I'm like, I want everybody to open your Twitter and find people you don't agree with, that you vehemently don't agree with, you passionately don't agree with, and put them in your feed. If you are a CNN person, put some Fox News in your feed. If you are a Wall Street Journal person, put some Washington Post in your feed, right? Put it all in your feed. If you're a Democrat, put some Republican in. If you're a Republican, put some Democrat in. If you're a Libertarian, throw in some Green Party. And that way you don't have, now some of that stuff is going to upset you, and that's okay, because you're taking yourself out of the echo chamber, but part of it is, don't put it in your feed so that you can then go in and go, wow, what a stupid article. If you haven't read the article, go in, think about what's said, listen to what other people are saying. And then if you still want to comment on it, great. If you want to retweet it, if you whatever you want to do, but take yourself out of the echo chamber. Hear some other voices. Think about why they're saying what they're saying. And fundamentally understand that most of the people you meet are just high quality people who want a good life for other people and for themselves. We just don't all have the same agreement on how to get there.
This reminds me of the safe spaces debate. I'm curious, what's your take on safe spaces? Because I want to create resilient students that can withstand the kind of arguments and discomfort and anxiety that they're going to feel when they enter into public discourse. But at the same time, I think there's a place for safe spaces. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, so I was talking about this with a friend of mine who is a psychology professor, and she was talking about, the original idea behind things like trigger words and safe spaces was really about people who had actual PTSD from real trauma. And so we have to acknowledge that real trauma exists. If you are a rape survivor who had an abortion because of this horrible thing, you may very well be absolutely emotionally devastated to be having that conversation in the classroom. And so being able to pull yourself out of that and to have a professor say, we're about to have a difficult dialogue and a really tough conversation about something. If this is something that you need to pull yourself out of, or you need to let me know ahead of time that you're not going to be in class, that's I don't think there's a problem with letting people know that, right? So, for example, if I'm talking about Nazism, which you teach propaganda, you have to, and I'm going to show some pretty nasty stuff to do that. Like some of the posters are just stomach turning in terms of that. If I put out a trigger warning that says, we're going to talk about some pretty awful stuff with Nazi propaganda. If this is something because you have recently experienced anti-Semitism or something similar, if you need to come talk to me or you need to take a step out of the room for this, I will not, I won't, I'm not going to ask any questions. I understand. So I'm always wanting to protect people's true mental health concerns need to be protected unaddressed. And we all have them, right? There's always something where you're like, I just can't. Now that's different than saying, I can't talk about anything, right? I don't want to address anything. I don't want to talk about anything difficult, right? So, we have to talk about things like, if you're going to talk about trans rights, you can't talk about trans rights without understanding it's a rhetorical question when you're redefining or defining what a woman is. Mm-hmm. So that's an issue that has very serious rhetorical consequences. So that's got to be a conversation we're allowed to have. How do we have it respectfully and in a way that allows everybody to have dignity? That's part of my job as a faculty member, to do my best to make sure that happens. But if I've got somebody who is in the middle of transitioning or has something where they're just at a heightened awareness, they're incredibly emotional, it's not a bad thing to say that's what's coming up. That's why we're online, right? So that people have the ability to say, okay, I can't have that moment, right? If you've got somebody, if you're doing Ouija boards in the classroom and you've got somebody, because you're teaching a religion class and you want to bring that example in, you've got somebody who's just lost a grandparent and they just can't be in that moment. Okay, right? Let them out of that moment, find something else for them to do in that moment. The flip side of that, though, as a faculty member, is I always caution people on forcing people to bring trauma in. So part of what we predict with people is that you are going to at some point have an essay that asks you to talk about resilience. I love resilience. It's a great conversation to have. We do want to have resilient people. But students have kind of gotten the impression somehow that what that means is if they can't show some horrible abuse or horrible thing in their life, they can't show resilience. And so we want to be careful about requiring students to share trauma. The way I talked about it with my students is we're sort of making stories currency now. Like it used to be that we could have a conversation about sexual assault and what the laws are and what that means, without really anybody having to talk about their personal experience if they didn't want to. Now it kind of gets to the point where if I don't come in with my personal story of sexual assault as my currency to the conversation, I'm disinvited. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. You're not allowed to talk about it. I don't want that, where students have to bring in their trauma or have to bring in their personal experience to have a valid conversation. Not that experiences aren't good and important and we don't want to honor them, but they shouldn't be required to have a conversation or to debate an important topic. And so that's that other piece of it is, no, we don't want to say we're not going to have hard conversations. Yes, we want to protect people who are feeling that this is something that is going to be damaging. But we also don't want to say you have to bring in your damaging stuff or write an essay on it, or else you're not part of the conversation at all. So, finding all of that balance is hard.
Yeah.
Nobody said this job was easy.
Yeah, of course. Having respect, right? Having respect for the stories. I love that you use the word currency because obviously I'm a big fan of storytelling and storytelling literature.
Yeah.
And I think Robert McKee pointed out the stories are the currency of human relationships.
Yeah.
Which is very different from what you were talking about in the sense that I have to have a story in order to participate in the conversation, which is not okay, right? We don't want you to think that you have to have a story in order to participate in any kind of debate or conversation. But at the same time, the stories that we elevate, the stories that we celebrate, the stories that matter the most to our cultural identity and our personal identity and our tribalism can both unite and divide in ways that haven't been seen in the past 20 years. And all of a sudden, these stories that we hold on to that are part of our cultural tribalism and identity are separating us, where they used to kind of hold us together, they're being separated. We're being separated by those same stories. And I'm wondering if with rhetoric and ideological criticism and the pentad and all of these tools, even neo-Aristotelian criticism, all of these tools that we have, I feel like there's a place for them to help to examine those stories in a way that can bring us back together where we've been pushed apart. And I wonder about the path forward, which we talked about earlier in this conversation, and how these kinds of tools might help, these kinds of questions might help in giving students who are about to enter this very messy world a path forward to participate in political discourse in a productive way.
I love teaching students how to tell stories. I think that's really important, especially when because we're storytelling creatures, right? That's how we persuade. That's why rhetoric has so many theories around narrative and around stories. From the perspective of somebody who's trying to improve rhetorical discourse, though, I want students to pull back from stories and question stories, because to me, if I'm looking at this from an Aristotelian lens, what I see is that ethos and pathos is eating logos for lunch. And that's dangerous. I see a lot of people who are arguing by anecdote, and you see people looking for the right story that fits the facts that they want rather than the facts, and then grab the stories that go with those facts. And so what I want students to do is know how to tell a good story, know when a good story is being told to you, but then be willing to question whether or not that story is indicative of a larger picture. And I give a really good example in my class, at least I think it's a good example. It's student loans. So we talk about student loans as a really great it's a debate that students are passionate about because they have loans. I have loans. It's a nice middle ground that we all have loans. So it's a good common ground, but it's not passionate enough that people are going to, sort of like, over it.
Not yet, anyway.
Not yet,
We
right?
might
So
be there soon.
we will. So we've got student loans as a topic. So we talk about what is the data around student loans versus the stories we hear. And I give this example of one that I heard a few years ago. I think it's been about 3 or 4 years now on NPR, about how student loans are drowning young people. They can't do anything. So the story is a young woman who goes to a big private college like NYU. Which I think is something like ridiculous, $85,000, $90,000. Well, not ridiculous to people who pay it, right? But for me, it was a ridiculous amount of money for me to be able to pay. And goes and gets a degree in a musical instrument like oboe or something, wants to be an oboe teacher. Now, I think most of us know statistically an oboe teacher is going to have a very difficult time paying off NYU loans. So her mother knows this too. So her mother tells her to go and get a business degree on top of it, which means I think staying another year and a half to complete a secondary bachelor's degree in business, so that she can get a job in business potentially as a backup. But she graduates, with oodles of loans, doesn't get a job in business, decides to go ahead and be an oboe teacher, and of course is drowning in her student loan debt. So I present this to my students. Is this really a great story to encourage the average voter that somebody needs to have their student loans forgiven? And they all are like, no, it's a terrible story. And we feel sorry for this person who has a lot of loans, but at the same time, picked one of the most expensive schools in the country, picked a major that was almost guaranteed not to provide an income that could pay off those loans, got a secondary degree in order to pay off the loans, and then didn't do the thing related to the secondary degree. So it's a good example of a story being kind of given to us because people thought it would pull at the heartstrings, but it's a great example of Fisher, right? I mean, it just doesn't hold together for us in terms of what they're trying to sell, which is that, if you want a great story that's going to sell, look at the data of the number of people who were misled by places like the University of Phoenix, who were told that they could pay all these loans off eventually, that they'd make X, Y, and Z amount of money, and talk about that story, right? And put data in it. And so that's what I'm trying to get people in my classes to understand, is that anecdote is great. It can be a great way of giving you an example of the data, but too often now it's being used to replace the data and sometimes doesn't even fit the data. Like this, NYU story didn't really fit the data they were giving us about all these poor people with all these poor student loans. So I love narrative. I think storytelling is one of the most powerful things we do as human beings. And I always tell my students, if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. But at the same time, it left Jesus's people questioning a lot, right? Like, well, what did he mean by that? And that can be very powerful, right? I want my students questioning, but when it comes to politics, I also want people to know the data. It would have been helpful if Jesus had said, look, this is the number of Pharisees who X, Y, and Z. And he never did that. He wasn't a data person.
Yeah, well, nuts and bolts. Yeah,
I'm a data person. Like, throw me some data and have people really understand what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And then give me a great story about it. But give me a little bit of data.
This reminds me, full disclosure, I love Star Wars. Star Wars, I grew up with Star Wars. I love Star Wars. It's fantastic. But what you just described has been described as part of the effect of the cultural conversation of Star Wars. In other words, the message of trust your feelings. Trust your feelings. And I get excited by that. I'm like, yes, trust your feelings, Luke. Use the Force. Yeah. And I start cheering and I'm excited. And I love all science fiction, and Star Wars has a special place in my heart. But that trusting of feelings has spilt over into a less critical mindset of data, as you described. So it's a little bit frustrating as someone who loves Star Wars to have that actual criticism that I kind of agree with, obviously, because if we're always trusting our own feelings, we're not using a critical lens.
Star Wars, though, I think the piece that people don't pull out enough, in my opinion, about the story of Star Wars, and it really comes clearly in the second Star Wars, right? It comes in The Empire Strikes Back, is that part of trusting your feelings is acknowledging that the dark side's powerful. The reason that we go down our Twitter rabbit holes and into our own little worlds and don't listen to other sides is because it feels great to have that validation that other people are just stupid. It really does. We're like, yeah, we're the smart ones. Woo, let's go get with other smart people and high five each other. Woo, Ryan, we're smart. Woo, other people are just selfish bastards. Woo. And that feels so good, right? Sharing a meme that we haven't thought anything about and doesn't have any deeper meaning, right? That feels good. And especially when we go get the likes, there's actual dopamine that goes up when you see those thumbs up and you see those likes. And so Star Wars is really applicable because the whole thing is, Luke, trust your feelings, but oops, we forgot to tell you that there's this whole dark side and it's really powerful and it wants to lure you in and you got to make some choices here. And that's really, to me, what the whole Star Wars trilogy, the first trilogy, is about. The second trilogy kind of goes into democratic politics in a very poor way. But in my opinion, I know Star Wars people are like, we hate you. But the trilogy was really about understanding that, yeah, you got to trust your feelings, but you got to know it is so powerful to be told that you're right. And thumbs up do that. When somebody hits the like button on a tweet, you get a rush that it just reinforces you to go back and tweet again something negative and tweet again something negative. And it's very, very dark. So it is trust your feelings, but recognize that I think we've all caught ourselves doing that, where we've shared something. I remember somebody shared a meme that was just so blatantly illogical and wrong. And I pointed out the illogicalness of it. Like, you are comparing apples and oranges. These are not the same things. And they took it down, like quietly, like pulled it down. But nobody says, by the way, everybody, I shared a meme. It wasn't a good meme. Somebody argued against it. They made good sense. I pulled it down, right? They just kind of pull it down like, oops, we don't want to tell anyone I made a bad argument. But that's what memes are, right? They're nth meme. And I love teaching students about nth memes because I'm like, where do you think that little word comes from? It's this reduction of what ought to be a really great, robust, nuanced, back to the nuance thing, argument into what fits in a little block inside of Facebook or Twitter. And that's not good. It's just not a good thing.
By any measure, it's not good. If enthymemes are our standard of judgment, we've got a problem because it literally goes against that kind of deeper digging.
It does. Well, and it's virtue signaling, which is another thing we've been talking about in my class. Like, rhetorically, what does virtue signaling do? And, now there are kind of GIF or GIF, depending on what you say, little memes that are like virtue signal received, right? Kind of now making fun of people who are virtue signaling. And so just the act of virtual signaling now is becoming something that we're talking about. What is the whole point of virtue signaling in society? What does it do for us? Again, it gets us likes, like, ooh, okay, yeah, you agree with me, like, and we get that shot of dopamine and we feel better. Whether or not we actually behave the way we just virtue signaled, probably not sometimes, but it's there.
Always, right?
It's a fun thing to study. So if somebody said, what would I love to study next? I would love to study, first of all, I would have fun studying the Twitter accounts of politicians who hate each other. Like, I would love to pull Ted Cruz's Twitter account and AOC's Twitter account and really do some side-by-side analysis of that. And see, because they have no shame. They'll just go after. There used to be a little bit, of shame, but there's no shame. They'll just go after each other and just see what kind of rhetoric is going on. It almost becomes insult comedy, and compare insult comedy to what is happening on the Twitter feeds of some of our esteemed politicians. That would be a fun one for me to do. I would love to see that. But I'm also really interested in gender stereotypes in business magazines. I think that's fascinating. How are we signaling gender roles for women CEOs, for example? How are those different than the gender roles we would have for male CEOs? So that's really interesting to me. So yeah, there's lots of that's why I tell my students there's infinite numbers of things that you can study. I'm always fascinated by what they decide to pick. And they pick things that are close to their hearts, and so they have fun doing the work.
You reminded me of the book Lean In, right? And that in and of itself would be a great thing to stay. Oh, you got it. Okay. Fantastic.
I do. I have a copy right here. Mainly for what you're talking about. We do talk about what the gender roles and the ideas are, particularly in regards to FOSS, which I also have here. And thinking about invitational rhetoric, for example, and the ideas of how, gendered rhetoric is. Why are women being required to lean in? Why are we the ones who are supposed to change? And this always gets into one of my favorite sayings of my father's, which was, something doesn't have to be right to be so. And so some of it is just strategic. Something can be wrong and still be the case, right? And so do we look at her book from that perspective? Do we look at it from the perspective of, she's giving us the best advice that she can in a world that's very gendered, so this is how you need to be successful in a gendered world? Or is she reinforcing stereotypes, etc.? And so that's a fun one to play with my students as well.
And there's always a tension between dismantling the system versus fitting within the system, and being able to find and negotiate that path after graduation, right? When you're going to have to, if you want to work in certain work environments, is critical to understand, because on one hand, you want to dismantle it. On the other hand, you have to make a living. So what advice do you have for people about to graduate who are about to be in that world where we have such different expectations based on gender?
Every single person has to approach this differently, because the things that upset me are not the things that upset other people. And so we all have to sort of think about it from our perspective. Where are we willing to take risks? Where are we willing to challenge stereotypes? Where are we not? And everybody has to find their own comfort level with that. From my perspective, that is something that I think about every single day. Where am I willing to be? Where am I willing to make concessions in my life, and where am I not willing to make concessions in my life? For me, I have always been honest with students about data. Again, I get back to data. When we talk about race, when we talk about gender, I pull in the communication research that backs up the issues so that we can talk about it with, look, this is what the data say. So for example, I was giving a talk the other night on women in communication, and somebody was asking me about gender stereotypes. I said, well, one piece of research shows that eye contact in an interaction between two people will change depending on gender. So if a man uses more eye contact, they're seen as less likable, less persuasive. A woman is expected to use more eye contact. And again, you can say, well, that shouldn't be the case, but it's the data. And so what I do is I encourage students to really pay attention to data, decide what they're trying, what is their goal. If I knew what I wanted, what would I do? And then lean into that. And so, but always do it in a way that's ethical and feels authentic to you as an individual. So if, for example, as a woman, you know that you want to wear slacks and flats and comfortable shoes, and you're not a makeup person, and you're not going to fall into a gender stereotype of women, taking a job where the dress code is a dress and heels and tights and makeup and jewelry and very strict, don't even apply for that. Right. If that's going to be something that you're going to be pushing back on, that's probably not where you want to apply. I mean, unless you really need the money and you really need that job and you can live within that environment. So, be authentic, look at the data, make choices, and know that as you get more power, it becomes easier to question power. It's something I think we all do when we're 18, right? We want to go, I'm going to get in there and challenge everybody. And some of us can do it. It's a great thing to think about. But at the same time, sometimes being sort of in the background and paying attention and making small changes and persuading in small ways, as we talked about, right? Moving people a little bit at a time. Like, gee, maybe pantyhose aren't necessary here. Wow, is it okay if I wear flats instead because, this is causing me pain in my feet? Little bits at a time, you can still make change. So I think everybody has to make decisions for themselves about what they feel is important to them and fight the good fight. I wish more students would get into politics personally. I used to work at the Strauss Institute, where we had a nonprofit, nonpartisan political campaign school. And the idea was we need more really good, ethical, smart young people jumping into the political world who are willing to fight for what they believe in, but represent other people in an ethical manner, get passionate about democracy. That's what democracy needs. So I really hope more of them will actually make a shift and think, hey, maybe public service is an area where I could be of use.
Yeah, that's where I remember. That's where I first met you. Was at the a special. It was a special scholarship kind of opportunity at the Annette Strauss. It was a workshop on how to be more rhetorical with your language specifically, and it was a wonderful experience. And it's great to hear that you're carrying that work forward in your rhetoric classes. Whenever students graduate, we'll be really lucky that 20 years later, if they remember just a few things. What are those things in your mind? What are the things that you want students to take away? What are the sound bites, or what are the ideas that you want students to take away and remember many years later?
Gosh. I want every single student to know that they have something to bring to the table. And I don't think we say that enough to people. I think there's this belief that some people have something to bring to the table and some don't. And it does not matter if you go on to a PhD, if you go on to work in human resources, if you go on to have children and stay at home. Every person has something to bring to the table, and there is no one way to live. There is no one definition of success. There is no one thing that you need to do to be genuinely who you are. And figuring out what that is the journey. Love the journey, value the journey. Not that you shouldn't have goals, but I think we're trying to press people into this idea that you must live an exceptional life. I think Instagram and all of Facebook push that idea on us. We sort of push it on students. Live the life you want to live. That's what I want my students to do. And I'm hoping that I'm giving them the tools to do that.
Well put.